Hi, everybody. I want to talk today about the literature of the Augustan period and extending that a little bit to literature that appears during the reign of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And all of this is with an eye to the assignments that you have. First of all, to comment on these sources and peruse all, but more importantly, to write a short paper about the influence of Augustus and the Augustan peace on the literature of this period. And so I'm not going to, take you exhaustively through these things. That's what the perusal assignment is about. But I do want to give you some tools that you can use to provide some good analysis of this period's literature. This is seen as one of the most important and most creative periods of culture in ancient Rome. It's called the Golden Age of Latin literature, and figures like Virgil and Horace and Ovid and Lucretius and others are truly giants in Western and world literature more generally. So let's start with Virgil. Virgil was born around 70 BCE in Mantua, which is in northern Italy, what was then Cisalpine Gaul. And he lived through many of the civil wars and things of the late Republican period, and earned a name for himself by writing kind of pastoral poetry. His works called the Georgics and the Eclogues gained him some notoriety, and after Augustus had taken control of the Roman Republic, Maecenas, his close advisor, set up this network of artists and poets and philosophers and others for whom Aeneas, or should say Augustus, we'll get to Aeneas in a minute, Augustus could be a patron, with the stipulation that these figures use their talents to celebrate the achievements of Augustus. And Virgil is the foremost of these. His early work earned him his fame, but it was after he went into the employ of Augustus. And what that meant was that he essentially had his living provided for. He was provided with a nice house and servants and slaves and the comforts of life and a handsome stipend and things like that to just spend his time writing poetry. And his chief composition from that period where he was working for Augustus is this work called the Aeneid. Like much of Roman literature, including most of the literature of the Golden Age, the Augustan Age, this is derivative of Greek literature. Though in this case, it's not like a cheap knockoff or something like that. Arguably, the Aeneid is a much tighter and more compelling story than the ones that it imitates, which is, of course, the epic poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. The first 6 books of the Aeneid are a kind of imitation of the Odyssey. We have a castaway on a sea voyage, encountering all sorts of perils in the Mediterranean as he tries to get to his destination, including going into the underworld. And then in the second half, the books 7 through 12, we have a sort of imitation of the Iliad, where Aeneas, the hero, then goes to war. And in fact, we have the setting up of this rivalry between Aeneas and Turnus, the king of the Rutulians, who were in the territory that Aeneas is fated to conquer. And Turnus himself has a lot of great characteristics, much like the hero Hector in the Iliad. But ultimately, Aeneas has the support of his mother, Venus, the goddess of love, and of fate itself. And he ends up conquering Turnus, actually in a way that's very similar to the way that Achilles kills Hector in the Iliad. And so, yeah, there's a lot of plagiarism, we might say, going on here, or at least riffing on themes that were already notable. But this is not uncommon, right? Virgil, though, does carry this to new heights, and a lot of it has to do with the influence of Augustus. Augustus asked him to write a sort of national epic, something that could celebrate the greatness of Rome and link Roman history with the mythological past, the kind of common mythology of the Mediterranean. And so he taps into stories that were already known or characters who were known in earlier literature. But in addition to that, to tie the mythology in Roman history to the reign of Augustus himself. And so as you read the Aeneid, you need to keep those things in mind, that those are the goals of this story, right? Aeneas is a character in the Iliad. He is noted as the son of Aphrodite. At one point in the story, late in the Iliad, he gets into a battle personally with Achilles, and Venus, or rather Aphrodite, knows that her son is not at this point a match for the greatest of the Greek warriors, and so she rescues him from a certain death. And it seems that that character had entered into the popular mythology in Italy, because as early as the Kingdom period, we have references to Aeneas and the Trojans having settled Italy, and that they were descended from this great heroic figure, and from, by extension, from Venus herself. The family of Julius Caesar, the clan of the Julii, traced their lineage directly back to Aeneas and to Venus, and believed, it seems, or at least this was part of their kind of identity, believed that they were descended from these divine beings and from this demigod Aeneas. And at the same time, Virgil is careful to weave in some of the main themes of Roman history, especially the rivalry with Carthage. As the story begins here at the beginning of Book 1, arms in the man I sing, the first who came compelled by fate, an exile out of Troy to Italy and the Lavinian coast, much buffeted on land and on the deep by violence of the gods through that long rage, that savage hate of Juno's. And he suffered much also in war, till he should build his town and bring his gods to Latium, whence in time the Latin race, the Alban fathers rose, and the great walls of everlasting Rome. Okay, and so the antagonist of the story, more than any other character, is Juno. Juno, known in Greek as Hera, the queen of the gods, the wife of Jupiter. She hates the Trojans for various reasons, and she also loves Carthage. And we find that Aeneas has been fated, and the influence of fate is paramount in this story. The Romans believed strongly in fate, that even the gods were subject to fate. Juno has heard that the fates have decreed that Aeneas is going to go to Italy and found this place that will eventually overcome her beloved Carthage, but she doesn't want that to happen, and she does everything she can to stop it from happening. Right? And some of this is brewing up storms to drive Aeneas off course, much like happens in some parts of the Odyssey. And he ends up shipwrecked in Carthage. Carthage is ruled by this woman named Dido, who came from Tyre, from Phoenicia, where her brother was ruling, and her brother had ended up killing Dido's husband. And Dido fled for her life and established this new place in Carthage. And so Aeneas ends up there, and Venus intervenes. She is the goddess of love, after all, and causes Dido to fall in love with Aeneas. As Aeneas tells the story of the fall of Troy in Book 2, which unfortunately is only paraphrased here. It's a really great story. But this gives the details of the fall of Troy, including the longest and most detailed account of the Trojan horse. And all of that. After Aeneas tells his story in Book 2 and Book 3, Dido ends up desperately in love with him, and even though she has sworn that she will never marry again after the death of her husband, and she has in fact been putting off suitors in neighboring kingdoms, she goes to her sister and basically says, I can't help myself. I am desperately in love with this man. And that's all, of course, Venus is doing. And Juno catches on to this, and she's like, hey, why don't we get these guys married? And Aeneas can stay here in Carthage. And Venus's response basically is, well, I wouldn't dare to oppose you, but fate may have something else in store for Aeneas. And all of this is precisely what happens. If we look here on page 227, let's go back to that. there's a storm that's brewed up by Juno, and to the same cave go Dido and Aeneas, where Juno, as a bridesmaid, gives the signal, and earth and fires of heaven alike bear witness, and mountain nymphs wail high their incantations. First day of death, first cause of evil. Dido is unconcerned with fame, with reputation, with how it seems to others. This is marriage for her, and this is all kind of beating around the bush that they have sex in the cave, right? That's what happens. And Dido says, well, this is marriage. I'm married to him now, right? And so she covers her folly with this name. This is an example of, what the Romans believed was the folly of women, that they tended to extremes, that they were unstable, that they were, that they lacked commitment and all of that. It's kind of interesting to see these stereotypes. Of course, they are rather ridiculous, but, they were believed nevertheless, right? And Dido is kind of the stereotypical faithless woman. Yet, part of the irony of that is Aeneas ends up leaving her, right? Why does he leave her? Well, Jupiter gets wind of what's happening there and sees the handiwork of his wife, and he has to oppose this because he's on the side of fate. And so he sends Hermes, or Mercury as he's called in the Roman tradition, to Aeneas to tell him to get out of Africa and off to Italy, where his fate is driving him. And Aeneas is like, okay, I got to do this, and he wakes up from this spell that he's under with Dido, but he faces the proposition of having to break up with her. And this is one thing that many people, I think, can identify with. A breakup is always difficult, or very often difficult anyway. It's especially problematic here, and this leads Dido to go absolutely insane and to curse Aeneas. And at the end, as she's about to commit suicide in her sorrow, she curses Aeneas and says, if he must come to harbor, then he must. If Jove ordains it, meaning Jove is another word for Jupiter, however vile he is, false and unspeakable, if Jove ordains the goal is fixed, so be it. In other words, he's got to get to Italy, then he's got to leave me, then fine, right? But let this be my curse on him. Hear my prayer. And she's praying here to Juno and also to Hecate, the goddess of dark magic in the underworld, and to the Furies, these avenging goddesses. Hear my prayer. Let him be driven by arms and war and exile. Let him be taken from his son Iülus. Let him beg for aid. Let him see his people dying unworthy deaths. Let him accept surrender on unfair terms. Never enjoy the kingdom. Let him lie unburied in the sand, right? I mean, these are really harsh words here. And then she says to her own people, right? And to you, O Tyrians, hate, and hate forever the Trojan stock. Offer my dust this homage. No love, no peace between these nations, ever. Rise from my bones, O great unknown avenger. Hunt them with fire and sword, the Dardan settlers, now, then, here, there, wherever strength is given, shore against shore, wave against wave, and war after war for all the generations. This is, of course, Virgil's attempt to explain why the Carthaginians hate the Romans so much. It's all about this jilted woman, right? A woman scorned, and all of that. This reference underlined here to a great unknown avenger, right? That is, of course, Hannibal, the great avenger of Carthage, who was being prophesied of here, and Virgil, writing with the benefit of hindsight, 150 years after Rome had defeated Hannibal, is sort of offering this prophecy, as it were, of that eventual conflict between Rome and Carthage. So that's linking Rome, the kind of Roman history, to the mythology. But as I said, Augustus was also interested in celebrating the glories of his accomplishments and his age, and linking that with this broader narrative, right? And we see that in a number of texts here. In Book 6, which is Aeneas' trip into the underworld, when he goes down and meets with his father, there's some interesting things here. One of the things that you might note is this whole section where they go by Tartarus, or Dis, which is kind of like the Roman equivalent of hell. And they don't actually go in, but his guide, the Sibyl of Cumae, who we talked about in an earlier class, this is that kind of priestess oracle of the Temple of Apollo, not in Delphi, but in Cumae in western Italy. She is the guide for Aeneas into the underworld, and she has been to Tartarus because it's part of the job description. The Sibyl needs to know. She guards the gate to the underworld, needs to know what's down there, and she, describes the kind of people who were there. Whoever in his lifetime hated his brother or struck his father down, whoever cheated a client or was miserly, how many of those there seem to be? Whoever went to treasonable war or broke a promise made to his lord, whoever perished, slain over adultery, all these walled in wait here their punishment. And she goes on further to say, the man who sold his country is here in hell, another who altered the laws for money, and a father who knew his daughter's bed. That's incest being referred to, of course. All of them dared, and more than dared, achieved unspeakable ambitions. If I had 100 tongues, 100 iron throats, I could not tell either their crimes or punishments. And you can go through and kind of unpack this. I don't necessarily want to do it for you, but you can find in here, the Roman value system and the key Roman relationships, things like patrons and clients and family relationships and master and slave or master and servant and all of that. And it's violations of these things and of the country, of the fatherland and all of that they're especially concerned with. And this is what would land a person in this terrible, terrible place. When Aeneas gets to Elysium, which is the Roman equivalent of heaven, also in the underworld, by the way. There is no heaven above. He meets up with his father and Anchises. His mother, of course, is Venus, so he's a demigod. But Anchises reveals to him the fate not only of Aeneas himself, but of the people who will come from him. And included in this are those, and he sees some of them here because the Romans had a concept of kind of reincarnation. That they would be reborn. And so he's seeing these in the fields of Elysium. And among these are, and this is paraphrased, unfortunately, Julius Caesar, Pompey, Augustus, right? Anchises talks to him about the glories of Rome to come. But even more powerfully is this section in Book 8, where Vulcan, or Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and also, coincidentally, the husband of Venus. And this is not a happy marriage. You may know some of the mythology there. It's a little bit ironic that this beautiful goddess of love and sex and these other things is married to this deformed god of the forge who, grunts and sweats away in this dark place with fire and all of that. But Venus, although she's faithless to him, she's still able to manipulate him. She goes to Vulcan and says, my son's got to go to war, make him a suit of armor. And Vulcan, being the master craftsman he is, weaves together this incredible suit of armor, which is not only a defensive thing, but it's also a work of art. And the level of detail to this is staggering. And of course, this is a mythological story, so you can do whatever you want. This actually is imitated. We might go back to something we looked at in an earlier lecture. This slide, which is of Augustus Caesar, you can see that this breastplate that he has on is decorated with all sorts of things. This seems to be an imitation of the text of Virgil. This goes into some of the detail that we find in this poetic tradition. But back to the story here. On the shield that he prepares as part of the suit of armor, we find this, right? In the center, that's the center of the shield, Actium. So there's a depiction of the Battle of Actium. The ships of bronze, Augustus Caesar stands high on the lofty stern, his temples flame with double fire, and over his head there dawns his father's star. Agrippa leads a column with favoring wind and God, the naval crown wreathing his temples. Antony assembles Egypt and all the east. Antony, victor over the lands of Dawn and the Red Ocean, marshals the foes of Rome, himself a Roman, with horror an Egyptian wife, right? So here's the description of Cleopatra. This taps into, of course, the propaganda of Augustus about Antony and Cleopatra. This is supposed to be depicted on the shield in almost lifelike fashion. And so this is you know, Virgil's attempt to tie in the glories of Augustus to this heroic mythological past. Okay, you can, take a look. There's a lot more to the Aeneid than what we've said here. I do want to spend a little time on these other poetic sources, starting with the odes of Horace. Horace was, like Virgil, in the orbit of Maecenas, but before that he had also kind of suffered through these civil wars. He actually joined up on the side of Brutus in the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar, and fought at the Battle of Philippi, or he was there at least, and according to Horace himself, he deserted rather than go into this battle, and that might have been his way of saying that he hadn't fought against Augustus at any point. But in any case, sorry for all of the calls and texts and things. My daughter's trying to get a hold of me, but I'm going to push through and I'll talk to her later. Where was I? Okay, so yeah, Horace was an interesting character in his poetry. Although it celebrates the reign of Augustus, it has a much deeper commitment to philosophical principles like the golden mean, which was a Greek idea, suggesting moderation in all things, and saying you really shouldn't get too excited about things, whether life is going bad or life is going good. Make sure you don't go to excess. Personal integrity seems to have been especially important to Horace, in that case, he seems to treat Augustus as something that's good because he creates conditions that allows people to live by these high standards of behavior and thought. But on the other hand, he seems to worry a bit about people thinking that Augustus is the solution to all their ills, right? That they need to have personal integrity. The other thing we should say about the poems of Horace is that they are beautiful, elegant things that he worked a great deal on. You'll see on the bottom of the page here I've written brevity, elegance, and polish. Those are three adjectives I think that describe, especially the odes, very, very well. Horace is purported to have said that one should work on a poem for at least 9 years before releasing it to the public. And so if he followed that tradition, it's a wonder that he ever was able to publish anything or release anything. And his output is not that great, to be honest, but what there is spectacular, right? I don't want to look at too many examples here. There's a lot to unpack in all of this. One that I find very interesting is this one on page 267, the death of Cleopatra, where on the one hand, he, again, like Virgil, sort of participates or taps into the Augustan propaganda about Cleopatra, presenting her as this lustful character, almost barbarian in nature, right? And he's, writing this from the viewpoint of one who fought in these wars against Cleopatra, right? So now to the dance, now to the wine, beating of feet, no fears can find, hay for the chance, feasting divine, feast for the gods, now comrades mine. And that's a kind of victory celebration in a sense. And then he launches into the midst of the battle against her. The Caecuban our fathers stored, that's a wine that they would have used in celebration, we had not dared to broach, for still the mad queen and her lustful horde of sexless heroes turned toward our empire and our sacred hill to ruin them with fire and sword. And so, that's the dark vision of Cleopatra that we find in this period. But then on the other hand, when he writes about her death by suicide, it's a rather flattering portrait of her. If we look at the last couple of stanzas here, nobler the death she chose to die, she felt no woman's dread of steel, nor sought to gain with speeding keel the unknown shores that further lie. She dared to turn her quiet gaze undimmed upon her fallen throne. She dared the angry snake to rise and drink its blood into her own. And this is, in a way, a celebration of kind of the golden mean and moderation and integrity and all of this, that Cleopatra was going to die on her own terms, right? She wasn't going to be taken captive or anything like that. She was going to go out her way. And he admires this. If you look at the last stanza, but she hated the vessel that bore her on to the triumph. She perished serene, boldest the moment her death was before her. Now but a woman, yet proud as a queen. Right? And so that is to be admired. So, on the one hand, he seems to be going along with Augustus, but then he turns around and does something rather surprising here, perhaps to say that we can find things to admire all over the place. This isn't all about Augustus and his world that he's created. And there's a lot about this avoiding extremes. This poem called The Golden Mean is one that we might note. Okay. And let me just read a couple stanzas of that. Most often when winds are raging, creaks the loftiest pine. With deafening crash fall tallest towers, on mountain peaks the lightnings flash. So the more things tend to extreme, in other words, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, really, is kind of the message of that. And so, moving on, then, the heart prepared for weal or woe, in sadness hopes, in gladness fears. Bleak winters which Jove sends below, he likewise clears. So if you, in the midst of sadness, if you have hope, and then in the midst of gladness, if you're careful to fear, right? Don't give in to the moment. Try to be moderate in everything. And this is the best way to proceed. This is the best way to survive in this world of chaos and turmoil. We can see that even in, this poem to Augustus here on page 271. On the one hand, he starts out very celebratory, best guardian of the Roman race and seed of kindly gods. Thou art too long from home, thy promise to the Holy Fathers heed, hark to our prayer, and come, O gracious princeps, is what that should be. This is not prince, right? We know what princeps is. That's the word that's translated there. O gracious princeps, restore thy country's light, for when thy countenance like balmy spring illumines ours, the sun sheds rays more bright, days flit on sweeter wing. Yet, the thing that's really important about Augustus is he's created this space where people can tend toward moderation, where, war brings out the extremes in people, and so now he's created this peaceful situation. People can't get too excited or for that matter, become too prosperous and profit off of war. So this part that's underlined here, by unchaste lust, no homes are now defiled. Morals and law have conquered that foul stain. Proud mothers trace the father in the child. Swift after wrong comes pain. So it really isn't about Augustus. It's again about personal commitment to these issues. Horace might be compared to the poet Lucretius, who was especially celebrated by Renaissance writers. Lucretius was a committed Epicurean who worried a great deal about people tending to extremes, and the way of suffering in a way was mitigated by the path of moderation. There's a lot of similarities one might draw between the Epicureans and the teachings of Buddha, though there are some distinct similarities too, or rather differences too. Horace is somewhere in there, maybe not as committed to this, especially philosophically, as Lucretius is, but Epicurean in another way. All right. And he celebrates things like, just nice summer days and good wine and just living a kind of mild life, right? That's part of the appeal of Horace, is that this is not heroic like Virgil. This is lyrical poetry that talks about simple things. I'm not going to go into detail about Ovid, although he is, I think, probably my favorite of all these Augustan age poets. He was also in the employ of Augustus, but later kind of had a falling out with him and ended up exiled from the court. The reason I like Ovid is he is the greatest repository in the ancient world of all of the mythological stories that we learn from the time we're young. At least I did. Much of that comes in the text called the Metamorphoses from Ovid. And, there's a good deal here that is inflected by the reign of Augustus. You can take a look at and see what you can find there. The last work I want to talk about, again, briefly, is this interesting poem, unfortunately found only in fragmentary form, not in its complete form. by a poet named Petronius. Now, Petronius was not around during the time of Augustus, or he may have been very young, I'm not sure. But he came to prominence during the reign of Nero in the 50s and 60s CE. And Petronius may have even been a kind of teacher, or at least a close confidant of Nero. This work is, it's satirical, hence the word satiricon. It is meant to be a kind of critique of Roman society in all of its features, especially high society, but this is a picaresque story. Now, what does that word mean? Well, a picaresque story, and it's arguably the first picaresque story in the Western tradition. This is a story in which the protagonist, although an unremarkable person himself or herself, ends up involved in a lot of things, historical and momentous in nature, travels all around, encounters a variety of circumstances, sees the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. A good example of a picaresque story that you might be familiar with is Forrest Gump, the novel or the movie. Probably the movie is more familiar. Where, if you've seen that, Tom Hanks plays Forrest Gump. He ends up, involved in all sorts of things, events and happenings in roughly the third quarter of the 20th century, right? He's an all-American football player. He fights in the Vietnam War and wins the Congressional Medal of Honor. He ends up meeting several presidents. He breaks Watergate. He is responsible for several kind of cultural symbols, and all these things, but he doesn't really realize what he's doing. He has a very low IQ. He's mentally challenged, right? But he ends up doing all these amazing things. That's a picaresque story, and the Satyricon is a picaresque story where these characters get involved in all sorts of hijinks all over the place, all over different parts of Roman society. And often picaresque stories just involve characters sitting down and telling each other stories that demonstrate points that are often quite cynical about human nature. One of these that it shows up in the Satyricon is the story of the widow of Ephesus. It's about this woman who was supposedly so faithful to her husband that when he dies, she takes up residence in his tomb and refuses to eat and spends all of her days like tearing her hair out and scratching her face and doing all these things that are symbols of mourning. And this one guy who thinks she's beautiful, goes into the tomb and says, you really are just kind of wasting your life away. It's a shame for you to do this. Why don't you, here, I've got some food. Why don't you eat some of this? And he convinces her to eat. And then he's like, you're really beautiful and it's just a waste of a good thing if you don't put that to use. And so, he talks her into taking him as a lover, and they have sex in the tomb of her husband. And this guy is a guard in the army, and he's responsible for overseeing these executions. And it turns out while he's off cavorting with this woman in her husband's tomb, that the family of one of his victims ends up taking the corpse, which would have been a disgrace, and he's going to be punished for this. They took the corpse off of the cross where it had been executed. And he's like, well, I got to go turn myself in. And she's like, no. Or he actually says, I'm going to kill myself because I can't face the punishment that's coming. And she says, well, I can't lose the only other man that I've ever loved besides my husband. And so she ends up taking her husband's body out of his tomb, where she supposedly has been keeping faithful vigil, although she's actually been cavorting with her lover, and puts it on the cross. So she sacrifices her husband's body. This actually would have compromised his underworld in order to save her new lover, right? And all of that, I guess, is to say that women are faithless, and even if they have this reputation, they're probably just pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. And it's a pretty cynical thing. The most famous part of this is this description of this banquet in high Roman society, and it goes into great detail about all the things they ate. I mean, it's to say that it's elaborate is not going far enough. There's this famous moment where there's a roasted boar, and this guy takes out his knife, as it says here. This is the marked part here on page 330. Drew a hunting knife and plunged it smartly into the side of the boar, whereupon thrushes flew out of the wound. Fowlers, ready with limed rods, caught them in a moment as they flew around the dining room, right? And so this is all for show, that they have somehow trapped live birds inside of this roasted boar, and when they cut it open, these things fly around, and then they catch those and roast them too. And so it's just this excess, right? There are many places where this story becomes mildly, or maybe more than mildly, pornographic, right? But all, I guess, for fun, and to some extent, represents the move away from the high-mindedness of the literature of the reign of Augustus to a kind of lowbrow sense in the reign of some of his successors, and really going back to the default Roman taste, I suppose. The other thing that you might learn from this is this might help you in interpreting the text we're going to read next week, which is Apuleius' story called The Golden Ass, which is also a picaresque novel, a few decades after the Satyricon, and taking part in that tradition. And so the things we talked about here apply in many cases to Apuleius. It is less obscene, I will say, for the most part, than the Satyricon is. So you can be thankful for that, I suppose. But it is a similar kind of story. All right. I think that's all I wanted to say about the literature of this period. Hopefully this has been helpful and can give you the tools now that you need to do some good source commentary, and especially to write the paper that's required of this. So